The rope bit into his hands, coarse and stiff with alkali dust. Below him, the dark was a cool, waiting mouth. It smelled of dry earth and something else, something metallic and wrong. The faces ringing the lip of the well were just pale, sun-bleached circles, their murmurs a distant hum like bees trapped in a jar. He was not a man given to heroics. Silas was a man of fences and furrows, of watching the sky for rain that never came and mending things that were already broken. But he was the one with the longest rope, and he was the one whose silence seemed to hold more weight than the other men's nervous chatter. So he had gone down. His boots hit the bottom with a soft thud, kicking up a puff of dust that tasted like a century of neglect. The light from above was a perfect, indifferent coin. In the gloom he saw her, a girl maybe 16, maybe less. She was thin as a fence rail, her dress the color of ditch water and torn at the shoulder. She was not alone. She was curled around a small body, a boy, his face turned away, his stillness absolute. Her arms were wrapped around him in a fierce, protective clench, her knuckles white stones against the boy's grimy shirt. Her own face was a mask of dirt and tear tracks, her eyes wide and dark and empty. They were fixed on nothing. She did not look at Silas. She did not seem to breathe. She just held on, as if her grip alone could deny the truth of the situation. The men above called down, "See anything, Silas?" Silas did not answer them. He knelt, the dry cracked earth of the well bottom pressing into the knees of his trousers. The air was thick, heavy. He could feel the finality in it. He reached out a hand, slow, deliberate, the way he would with a spooked mare. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was a low rumble, and used to this kind underscore of softness. It sounded like it came from under floorboards. She did not flinch. Her gaze remained locked on some distant, private horror. The only movement was a slight tremor in her jaw. He knew what he had to do. He could not bring them both up at once. He could not leave her down here. Gently, he put his hand on her shoulder. The fabric of her dress was rough, almost brittle. Beneath it, her shoulder blade felt like the wing of a starved bird. "I have to," he whispered, more to himself than to her. "I have to take him." For the first time, her eyes moved. They slid from that nothing space to his face. There was no fight in them, no plea, just a vast, barren emptiness. But her grip on the boy tightened, a final, desperate refusal. Her fingers were like tangled roots grown into the earth of her brother. He had to pry them loose, one by one. It was the hardest work he had ever done. Each finger he unfurled felt like breaking a bone, like tearing a seam in the very fabric of the world. She made no sound. "Nu sobe, nu crai." Just that awful, profound silence as he separated the living from the dead. He wrapped the boy in a spare grain sack he'd brought down, his movements methodical, his face grim. He secured the rope and gave it 3 sharp tugs. The men above began to haul. The small bundle ascended into the light, leaving the two of them alone again in the cool, breathing dark. Now he turned back to her. She was a ruin, slumped against the curved wall of the well, her hands lying open in her lap, empty. They were curled slightly, remembering the shape of what they had held. He looped the rope under her arms. She was light, a thing of air and sorrow. As he secured the knot, his calloused fingers brushed the skin of her back through the tear in her dress. It was cold, cold as stone. "Time to go," he said, his voice still that low rasp. He gave the signal, and they were pulled upward, into the unforgiving glare of the sun. The faces that met them were a mixture of pity and morbid fascination. The sheriff, a man named Gable whose authority was as thin as his hair, stepped forward. "Well, Silas, that's a sorry business." Silas just nodded, untying the rope from the girl. She stood on her own, but she swayed, a sapling in a hard wind. Her eyes were still vacant, her body a shell from which the spirit had fled. Jedediah Crane, the man who owned this stretch of worthless land, pushed through the small crowd. He was a man whose softness was all in his belly and not in his heart. "Squatters," he spat, looking at the small, shrouded form laid out on the ground. Been telling them to move on for months. Serves them right, drinking bad water. The well was dry, Jedediah, Silas said, his voice flat. He did not look at Crane. He was watching the girl. What's to be done with her? The sheriff asked, scratching his neck. No family to speak of. Can't just leave her. Crane sniffed. Not my problem. She's a vagrant. Send her to the county asylum. They'll take her. At the word asylum, something flickered in the girl's face. A shadow crossing a barren field. Her hands began to tremble. Silas saw it. He had seen that look before in the eyes of animals caught in traps. The moment they understood there was no escape. He looked at the sheriff, at Crane's smug face, at the whispering townsfolk. He thought of the hollow silence in his own cabin, a silence that had been his only companion for 2 years, a silence that was a different kind of well. He stepped forward, placing himself slightly in front of the girl. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a few worn coins. Not enough for anything, really, but it was a gesture. I'll take her, he said. The sheriff blinked. Silas? What for? You don't need the trouble. Got a debt with her people, Silas lied. The lie came easy, a simple tool to fix a complicated problem. Owed her father. I'll see she's cared for. Crane scoffed. She's damaged goods, Silas. Look at her. Silas finally turned his head and met Crane's gaze. His eyes were the color of a winter sky, and they carried whole winters in them. I am looking, he said. The words were quiet, but they fell with the weight of stones and ended the conversation. No one argued with Silas when he used that voice. He took the girl's arm. It was a light, hesitant touch. She did not resist. He led her to his wagon, a sturdy, plain thing like the man himself. He helped her up onto the seat. She moved like a doll, her limbs obeying a will that was not her own. He covered the small, shrouded body of her brother with a canvas tarp in the back of the wagon, his movements full of a rough, solemn grace. The journey back to his homestead was made in silence. The clatter of the wheels over the rutted track was the only sound, a rhythmic, jarring percussion against the vast, open quiet of the plains. The wind lifted dust from the trail behind them like ghosts rising and falling. He did not try to speak to her. Words were useless things now. Instead, about a mile out of town, he stopped the wagon and reached for his canteen. He uncorked it and held it out to her. She stared at it, uncomprehending. He touched it lightly to her cracked lips. Drink, he commanded softly. She drank. A little at first, then a long, shuddering pull. Water ran down her chin, tracing clean paths through the grime. When she was done, she leaned back against the hard seat, her eyes closing for a moment. It was the first sign of life he had seen in her that was not pure, reflexive terror. They reached his cabin as dusk was bleeding blood orange and purple across the horizon. The cabin was small, built of hand-hewn logs, weathered to a silver gray. It stood alone against the enormous sky, a testament to endurance. A single, small mound of stones lay under a sparse juniper tree a short distance away. His wife's grave, Sarah. He helped the girl down from the wagon. She stumbled, her legs unused to standing. He caught her, his hands firm on her upper arms, holding her steady. For a second, she leaned against him, her weight almost nothing. Then she straightened, pulling away into her own space. He led her inside. The cabin was one room, clean but Spartan. A stone hearth, a rough-sawn table with 2 chairs, a bed in one corner, and a small, curtained-off alcove in another. It smelled of wood smoke, old sorrow, and soap. He gestured to the alcove. You can sleep there. It had been Sarah's space, where she kept her sewing and her books. He had not touched it in 2 years. Now he was giving it away. He did not let himself think about what that meant. She walked to the curtain and slipped behind it, disappearing. He heard the faint sound of the cot creaking as she sat down. For a long time, he just stood in the center of the room, listening to the silence that was no longer entirely his own. It was a shared silence now, heavier and more complex. He went to the hearth and built a fire, the familiar motions of striking flint and steel a small comfort. The flames caught, painting the simple room in flickering, gentle light. He took a pot, filled it with water from the barrel and set it to warm. He sliced potatoes and onions into it, adding a chunk of salted pork. A simple stew. He worked with an economy of motion, his hands sure and steady. The smell of the food began to fill the cabin, a scent of life in a house that had been a tomb. He ate his portion at the table, his eyes on the curtain. It did not move. After he finished, he filled a second bowl and placed it on a small stool just outside the curtain space. "Food," he said to the curtain. He waited. The fire crackled. The wind keened around the corners of the cabin. Finally, a pale, thin hand emerged from behind the fabric, its fingers trembling slightly. It hesitated, then retreated. A moment later, it reappeared and took the bowl. Silas let out a breath he did not know he was holding. He banked the fire for the night and went to his own bed. He did not undress, just kicked off his boots and lay down on top of the quilt. He lay awake for hours, listening. He heard no sound from the alcove, but he could feel her presence there. A small, wounded animal hiding in the dark. He did not lock the door. He had never locked it. But tonight, the fact seemed important, a promise he was making to the silence. The next morning, he rose before dawn and went out to deal with the grim task in the back of the wagon. He chose a spot not far from Sarah's grave, under the same lonely juniper. He dug, the shovel biting into the hard, dry soil. The work was hard, but it was honest. It was something to do with his hands, something to do with his grief, and hers. When he was finished, he made a small cross from 2 pieces of scrap wood and drove it into the fresh-turned earth. When he returned to the cabin, the empty bowl was sitting on the stool, washed clean. And so the days began to pass, stitched together with raw thread. They lived in a world made of silence and routine. He would rise, do his chores, mending fences, tending to his few chickens, clearing stones from a field he had no real hope of ever farming. She would emerge from the alcove after he had left, a ghost in her own home. First, she did nothing. She would simply sit on the chair by the cold hearth, her hands in her lap, her eyes fixed on the grain of the wooden floor. She looked like she had been hollowed out, a vessel waiting to be filled or to crumble. Then, slowly, things began to change. The changes were small, almost imperceptible. One day he came in from the fields to find the floor had been swept. The broom, made of bound twigs, was resting neatly by the door. He said nothing. Another day, a small cup of water appeared on the table while he worked, a silent offering against the afternoon heat. He began leaving tasks for her. A pile of mending with a needle and thread laid beside it. A bucket of potatoes that needed peeling. He never asked her to do them. He just left them, invitations without words. And one by one she accepted. Her stitches were small and neat. The potatoes were peeled with a careful hand. She was stitching herself back into the world, one tiny, mundane act at a time. They ate their meals in silence, sitting at opposite ends of the small table. He would watch her out of the corner of his eye. She ate slowly, deliberately, as if rediscovering the very concept of sustenance. Her hair, once a matted tangle, she had washed and combed. It hung down her back, the color of dried corn silk. The gauntness was still in her face, but a flicker of life had returned to her eyes. They were no longer empty voids, but deep, watchful pools. She observed everything. The way he held his fork, the way the firelight caught the cracks in his worn hands, the way his gaze would sometimes drift to the grave outside the window. One afternoon, he came back to the cabin earlier than usual. A cold wind had turned mean, promising an early frost. As he approached, he heard a sound. It was faint, thin, a humming. He stopped, listening. It was a simple, meandering tune, a melody with no beginning and no end. He pushed the door open quietly. She was standing at the window looking out at the 2 graves. A single wildflower, a stubborn purple speck she must have found clinging to life by the creek bed, was clutched in her hand. She was humming to the graves. She heard him and the sound cut off instantly. She spun around, her eyes wide with alarm, as if he had caught her in a crime. She held the flower behind her back. He said nothing of the humming. He just nodded toward the window. "It's a good spot," he said, his voice rough. "Gets the morning sun." She watched him, her expression unreadable. Then, she walked past him, out the door. He watched from the window as she went to the 2 mounds of stone. She knelt first at the small one, her brother's. She stayed there a long time. Then she rose and went to the larger one, Sarah's. She hesitated, then gently placed the purple wildflower on top of the stones. Something shifted in Silas's chest, a loosening of a knot he had carried for 2 years. He had put flowers on that grave every week until the drought killed every last one. He had stopped trying. This girl, who had lost everything, had found one, and she had shared it. That night, the cold settled in deep. He built the fire up high, the logs hissing and popping. He saw her shivering in her thin dress, her arms wrapped around herself. He went to a wooden chest at the foot of his bed and pulled out a heavy wool shawl. It was dark blue, and it still smelled faintly of Sarah, of lavender and wood smoke. He had not touched it since she died. He walked over to her and held it out. She looked at the shawl, then at him, her eyes full of questions she could not ask. "It's cold," he said simply. She took it. Her fingers brushed his as she did. A brief, shocking touch of warmth. She wrapped it around her shoulders, pulling it tight. The deep blue made her look even paler, more fragile. She sat by the fire, bathed in its warm glow, and for the first time, she did not retreat to her alcove immediately after their meal. She stayed, watching the flames dance. He sat in the other chair, cleaning a piece of tack, the silence between them no longer a void but a space they shared, a quiet companionship. A few days later, she tried to bake bread. He came in to a cabin filled with a thin haze of smoke and the smell of scorched flour. A small, blackened lump that looked like a piece of charcoal sat on the table. She stood over it, her face a mixture of frustration and defeat. He picked it up. It was heavy as a rock. He tapped it on the table. It made a solid thunk. A small, choked sound came from her throat. He looked at her and saw, to his astonishment, that she was trying not to laugh. Her lips were pressed tight, her shoulders shaking. He set the loaf down. "I think," he said, his own mouth twitching, "that loaf died in vain." A laugh escaped her. It was a rusty, unused sound, like a hinge being forced open after years of disuse. But it was a laugh, and in that moment, the entire cabin seemed to breathe again. The ghosts in the corners drew back. The sorrow that had stained the very walls seemed to lighten. "A little dry," she whispered. Her voice was thin, reedy, but it was clear. He met her eyes, a real smile touching his own lips for the first time in memory. "You didn't complain about mine." It was a start, a crack in the ice. From then on, words came, though they were few and far between. They fell into the silence like pebbles into a deep well, sending out ripples. "More wood?" she would ask. "Yes," he would reply. "Rain's coming." "I know." One evening, as they sat by the fire, she spoke into the comfortable quiet. "Why?" He didn't have to ask what she meant. He had been waiting for the question since the day he'd pulled her from the well. He stopped his whittling, looking at the small bird taking shape in his hands. "I had a daughter," he said, his voice low. "She would have been about your age. Fever took her. Took her mother a year later." He gestured with his head toward the graves outside. "When I saw you down there, it just seemed right. A man ought to do what seems right." She absorbed this, her gaze soft in the firelight. "You're either the kindest man I've met," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "or the most foolish." He looked up, his eyes meeting hers across the flickering space between them. "Can't I be both?" The first harbinger of the past arrived on a day when the sky was a bright, clean blue. A rider, not from the nearby town, but from the east. He was dressed too finely for the territory, his horse too clean. He stopped his horse a ways from the cabin and watched it for a long time before approaching. Silas saw him from the field. He put down his post-hole digger and walked back toward the cabin, his stride unhurried but purposeful. The girl was outside, hanging washed clothes on a line he had strung for her. She saw the rider, and all the newfound life drained from her face. She froze, a white sheet clutched in her hand, clinging to her like wet paper. The rider dismounted, his boots crunching on the dry ground. He had a letter in his hand. He ignored the girl, addressing himself only to Silas. "I'm looking for a girl," the man said, his tone insolent. "Found in a well a month or so back. Property of Jedediah Crane." "She ain't property," Silas said, his voice dangerously quiet. "And she ain't here." The man smirked. "Mr. Crane says different. He says he has a claim. Says she was living on his land, so what's on it is his. He's coming in a few days to collect her." He held out the letter. "This is a formal notice. He wants her back. No trouble." Silas did not take the letter. He just stared at the man until the smirk on his face faltered. "You can tell Mr. Crane he knows where I live." The man, unnerved by the cold finality in Silas's eyes, backed away, mounted his horse, and rode off, leaving a trail of dust and dread behind him. Silas turned to the girl. She was trembling, her eyes wide with the old terror. The shell was closing around her again. "Don't let him," she breathed, the words a desperate plea. "Don't let him take me." "I won't," Silas said. It was a vow. 2 days later they came. Jedediah Crane rode in a buckboard, 2 hired men on horseback flanking him like vultures. They stopped in the yard, and Crane climbed down, his bulk straining the seams of his town coat. Silas was waiting on the porch, a heavy axe handle resting in his hands. He was not holding it like a weapon, just holding it. The girl stood in the doorway behind him, a shadow framed by the dark interior of the cabin. "Silas?" Crane boomed, trying for a friendly tone that soured in the tense air. "Let's not make this difficult. I've come for what's mine. The law is on my side. She's a vagrant, a ward of the county, and I've filed the paperwork to take her on as an indentured servant. It's for her own good. She has a home," Silas said, his gaze as steady and unyielding as the rock-hard earth beneath his feet. "This hovel," Crane laughed, a wet, ugly sound. "This isn't a home. It's a grave you haven't laid down in yet. Now send her out." He took a step toward the porch. Silas didn't move, but he shifted his grip on the axe handle. The movement was slight, but it was enough. Crane stopped. "I'm not asking, Silas. And I'm not giving." From behind Silas, a voice spoke, clearer and stronger than he had ever heard it. "My name is Lena." Crane turned his head, surprised. Lena stepped out from the doorway, into the light. She was still thin, still pale, but her chin was lifted, her eyes blazing. She was no longer a ghost. "My name is Lena," she repeated, her voice ringing with newfound conviction. "And I am not your property." Crane's face turned a blotchy red. "You have no say in this, girl. You are nothing. A piece of salvage," he gestured to one of his men. "Go get her." The hired man started to move, his hand going to the pistol at his hip. But before he took 2 steps, Silas moved. He was not fast, but he was inexorable. He stepped off the porch and stood directly in the man's path. He raised the axe handle until it was pointed at the man's chest. "You will not touch her," Silas said. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the air, sharp and final as a headsman's axe. The hired man hesitated, looking from Silas's cold, dead-certain eyes to Crane's furious face. He was paid to be tough, but not to die over a worthless girl in a worthless stretch of dust. "He ain't worth it, boss," the man muttered. Crane sputtered, his authority crumbling. "She belongs to me. I have papers." "Your papers don't mean a thing out here," Silas said. "This is my land. She is my family. Now get off my property." It was the word family that hung in the air, changing everything. It was a claim far stronger than any piece of paper Crane could wave. It was a wall built of something more solid than law or ownership. Crane, defeated not by violence but by the sheer, unshakable force of a man who had found something to protect, and a woman who had found her own voice, cursed under his breath. He heaved himself back into his buckboard, his face a mask of impotent rage. "This isn't over, Silas," he spat. "Yes," Silas said, watching them retreat. "It is." He stood there until they were nothing more than a dust cloud on the horizon. Then he turned. Lena was still standing on the porch, her hands clasped together so tightly her knuckles were white. The fire had left her eyes, replaced by a profound, trembling exhaustion. He walked up the steps and stood before her. He gently took the axe handle from his own hands and set it against the wall. He looked at her, at the fierce, fragile woman who had named herself in the face of oblivion. "Lena," he said, trying the name on his tongue. "Fit. It's a good name." Tears welled in her eyes, but they were not tears of terror or grief. They were something else entirely. She reached out a hesitant hand and laid it on his forearm. It was the first time she had touched him by choice. "I was scared," she whispered. "I know," he said, and in that moment, standing on the porch of the small, weathered cabin, with the wind whispering through the juniper tree, the unspoken contract was sealed. They were no longer just a man and a girl. They were a bulwark against the world. They were a family. That winter, the first snows came early, blanketing the prairie in a soft, clean white. The world outside was hushed and still. Inside the cabin, the fire burned bright. The room was warm, filled with the scent of baking bread. A perfect, golden brown loaf cooling on the table, and the quiet rhythm of two people sharing a life. Silas sat by the hearth, mending a leather strap. Lena sat in the other chair, stitching a new patch onto one of his shirts. The silence between them was no longer empty or heavy. It was full. It was a language of its own, woven from shared hardship and unspoken kindness. He looked up, watching her in the firelight. He watched the way her brow furrowed in concentration, the deft, sure movements of her fingers with the needle. He saw the woman she was, and the woman she was becoming, resilient, brave, whole. He thought of the man he had been, a hollow shell living beside a grave. He was not that man anymore. The girl he had pulled from the well had, in turn, pulled him from his own. She looked up, catching his gaze, and offered him a small, quiet smile. The house, which had once only held echoes of the past, now breathed with the promise of a future. The fire only changes everything if something new is waiting in the ash. And there, in the warm, flickering light, something new had taken root. This story, it isn't just about a rescue. It isn't about a strong man saving a damsel. That's too simple a tale for a world this complicated. No, this is a story about the quiet, stubborn truth that sometimes the most broken things can fit together to make something whole. It's about how the deepest healing doesn't come from grand gestures, but from the silent, steady offering of a safe space, a warm meal, and the dignity of a name. Silas didn't just pull Lena from a hole in the ground. He stood beside her while she climbed out of her own, and she, in her quiet, resilient way, filled the hollow spaces in his life with purpose, with warmth, with the sound of humming. They didn't save each other. They made a place where they could both be safe enough to save themselves. So here is your naming. In the empty spaces of your own life, in the wells of your own grief, what small kindness can you offer? What silent promise can you make? Because out there, in the vast, indifferent quiet, there is always another soul listening for the sound of a footstep that means they are no longer alone. And if you are brave enough to take that step, you might just find that the home you build for them is the one you have been searching for all along.